Hello everyone, today our special guest is Mr. Stephen Friedman, who graduated from Harvard, a molecular biologist, a philosopher, and also acclaimed as genius philosopher from New York Times. Welcome, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am very honored to be here and very pleased to be participating in this recording session.
Thank you for being here today with us. Also, it's our honor. And Our first question for you is, what was the main motive in your life to choose philosophy and become successful in that field?
It's something that came to me as an interest and a passion from an unusually young age, I think, for the subject, but it came as an accident. When I was very young, 7, 8, 9, 10. I was reading from a young age, and I was always drawn to books. I was an only child, and reading was one of the main forms of entertainment, and stimulation that I experienced. The earliest books that I was focused on, though, were in the sciences. I would read math, I would read science, not necessarily advanced things, just things that were age appropriate. But as time went by, I began reading more and more sophisticated books. And at some point when I was around the age of 10, just kind of by accident, at the encouragement of my parents, I joined a book club. And the book club was called the Library of Science. But what was significant about it was the books that it made available, like on a monthly basis, were college textbooks in different subjects, like math, physics, psychology, things obviously way beyond, what I was able to understand at that point. But I was adventurous. And one of the first books I got was a physics textbook that I tried reading. I remember the first night I read the first paragraph. It took me one whole night to read that paragraph with no understanding at all. But I kept on reading. And what I found was that even without, going elsewhere for explanations or people, giving me instruction in it, as I just continued to read day after day, a little bit, things got more understandable just through my own efforts. And I just kept going. And eventually, that subject, the subject of physics, became something that I could cope with at a young age. And that was kind of the level of intense involvement in these subjects that I began exploring. But for the first couple of years of that level of reading, it was science and math. But then one day, I happened to go into an actual bookstore, and I found a book on the shelf. The title was Science and the Modern World. And I thought, okay, that sounds like the kind of thing I might be interested in. It was written by a famous writer, Alfred North Whitehead. Turns out, Alfred North Whitehead wasn't exactly a scientist. He was a mathematician, but especially a philosopher. And it turns out that book was philosophy, difficult philosophy. Now, at the time, I was taking like a summer school classes at Caltech, which was not far from where I lived, but far enough that I could take a bus, and it would take me like 30, 45 minutes to get there. But it was years ago, so it was safe to do that. My parents allowed me to do that. And on that bus ride, back and forth, I would read that book, Science in the Modern World. It was incredibly difficult, but I was captivated by it. And it turns out, I didn't know that at the time, the book is considered to be difficult philosophy. So I was introduced to difficult philosophy by accident at a young age and introduced to the power of the subject. And the main power that became apparent to me based on like the Whitehead approach to the subject was its ability to stand in judgment and evaluation of every other human activity, including the sciences, including scientific methodology. And I came to learn that philosophers had effectively created science as a method. And from that point on, it became increasingly my singular focus. But for a number of years after that, it was still physics and science and math on the one hand and philosophy on the other. When I was ready to apply to college, I was thinking of majoring in both subjects, majoring in physics, majoring in philosophy. When I got into college, though, my first semester, it turns out that the physics course that was appropriate for me to take was offered at the same time as the philosophy course that was appropriate for me to start philosophy with. I kind of made a choice. I chose philosophy, and that's been the direction ever since. But not that I've abandoned ever the sciences, but I've simply found philosophy the more ultimately comprehensive and powerful discipline. And my interest has been sort of really effectively focused on it more than any other field that I've explored.
So now I want to ask you, what is happiness for you, and is striving for improvement in one's life a core component of human happiness?
Whenever I hear a question about happiness, what immediately comes to mind is a quotation that I tell people almost on a daily basis. It seems to come up frequently. It's a quotation from the 19th century German writer, philosopher, even scientist Goethe. Goethe, in fact, was, and I only learned this maybe 6 months ago, Einstein's favorite author. Goethe said, "If you would be happy, you must do your duty." And what is your duty? The demand of the hour. In other words, it's a matter of responding to circumstance. And it operates at every level. It doesn't have to be something in terms of grand, designs or enterprises or ambitions. If you have an assignment, rather than procrastinating, doing it the night before it's due, if you do it right away, once it's done, you will feel a sense of not just accomplishment, but of happiness at having been released from the burden, plus the satisfaction of the accomplishment, the achievement. So that is, I find, the simplest sort of exhibition of how happiness can enter our lives. In terms of goals, yes, it relates, I think, to that quotation, that if you have a goal, if you have a mission, if you have a direction that you're going to go in, that mission, goal, direction will place demands upon you. You rise to the occasion, to the level of that demand, and that will increase your happiness. I live in Los Angeles, and one thing I've found about that environment is the city itself doesn't really give you a lot in terms of presence. There are older established cities, a Rome, a Paris, where when you go, you feel the weight of the city, the weight of its history, its culture, and it can sort of guide and even motivate you. Los Angeles doesn't do that. Los Angeles pretty much leaves you alone. So in order to flourish, I think, to succeed well among people that I've known, and it applies to myself, in Los Angeles in particular, you need a mission. You need a purpose, a direction. And having that purpose and direction, it can sort of orient you. It can organize your efforts, it can direct your efforts, and it can provide those moments of accomplishment that is as significant in achieving happiness as anything. Because you're rising to the demand, the duty that mission is imposing upon you.
So in this modern world where we live, there are a lot of people that are asking themselves if they have enough control over their lives. So according to you, how much control do people have over their own lives?
I think it's important to understand that we exist in a social environment, social framework. Insofar as we are sort of interacting socially, we are engaging with individuals, circumstances that can impose their own demands upon us. But from a philosophical standpoint, what's most important, what's decisive, is our distinctiveness from everything else, everybody else. That we exist in difference, in distinction from everyone who has ever lived, from everything that has ever existed. And I think it's fundamental to our sense of self, our sense of dignity, our sense of worth, that we recognize that distinctiveness, that whatever has applied or might apply to others does not necessarily apply to us because of any difference between us and everyone else. Where others have failed, we can succeed because we are in a different place. Even if we're across the room from somebody else, that can be a decisive difference in our circumstance, in our perspective on the world. So the most important thing is to embrace the fundamental nature of our existence as being different, as being, I say often, any two things, any two individuals are approximately the same for some purpose or other, but rigorously distinct. And our dignity, the religious term that applies here that I use metaphorically, our salvation, is recognizing the power of that circumstance by which we exist at all. So I think that's something to keep fundamental in our mind, that we can make comparisons if we want, but those comparisons are made at will, at our choice. Nothing in the nature of our circumstances forces those comparisons. A lot of people suffer online and social media because they're constantly comparing themselves. They're comparing themselves to their friends. They're comparing themselves to celebrities. They're comparing themselves to people that are creating an image of themselves as having some extraordinary life or extraordinary experience. We don't know, the internal circumstances of somebody else. We can't evaluate, we can't judge, and we certainly can't make claims about their having a better sort of life or set of circumstances. You can't possibly know. But what you can embrace is the dignity and distinctiveness of who and what you are. That where you stand, what you are experiencing, has never been experienced before in the history of existence. And what matters ultimately, philosophically, is what you alone are experiencing every moment of every day. That cannot, even in principle, be shared rigorously. That's what needs to be understood. Compare if you like, but if you find it becoming a burden, if you find it becoming a source of despair, stop. Nothing is forcing it. The only thing you are forced to do, ultimately, is recognize that where you stand, no one has ever stood before. And so whatever might apply to someone else, wherever others have failed, you need not fail. You can always succeed no matter what, regardless of what's happened before.
It is known that all the people in the world have problems, but they also have dreams and desires. So we're talking about philosophy, and how can it help us not to give up on achieving our dreams despite certain obstacles in our lives?
Okay. I make a distinction in philosophy between what is known for absolute certainty and everything else. Our present circumstances, what we're experiencing right now, what we're seeing or hearing or feeling, those are things that are unchallengeable. Doesn't matter if somebody says to you, what you're experiencing is not what you're claiming to be, they're in no position to make that assertion. You can always maintain, the integrity of your experience. But I forgot. Oops. Um, what can we repeat that? The
Yes,
question?
yes,
Yeah,
of
repeat
course.
the question. Yeah, sorry.
How can philosophy help us not to give up on achieving our dreams
Okay. Okay.
despite certain
Yes.
obstacles?
Yes. So the point is that every set of circumstance is different. Now, there's a famous saying in contemporary culture: doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is insanity. Right? I hear that on a daily basis, like in the United States. It's wrong. The battering ram proves it wrong. And the fact of the matter is, repetition is one means of achieving mastery. When you are trying to master a language or a musical instrument or some skill, you are engaged in repetitive behavior and you gain new goals and new accomplishments by doing that because you cannot ever rigorously repeat yourself. Every time you do something, it's done a little bit differently, and at the very least, it's done against a different background of experience. The fifth time you attempt something is different from the fourth because it is the fifth rather than the fourth. Every set of circumstance is in detail unique, which means that if under one set of circumstances you haven't achieved something rigorously, you can't claim that under a different set of circumstance it's not possible. So there's a general principle that I stress, and that is when we're not doing philosophy, when we're not doing something that is absolutely certain beyond all possible doubt, when we are doing things like attempting to achieve a goal where we don't know if we're going to achieve it or not because we haven't achieved it yet. And we can always fail no matter how close we get. And we can always succeed no matter how far we seem like we're removed from it. There's a principle that at some level of effort, at some level of repetition, at some level of bringing the right ingredients together, anything is possible because circumstances are always different. And whatever is different in one set of circumstances from another might be the decisive difference. And so, and the other example I often like to use is that of Van Gogh, in terms of assessing your abilities, your qualities, your capacities. Van Gogh has emerged as the most popular great painter in history. He is more celebrated now than probably any other figure in the history of art. Van Gogh began art at the age of 27, which is kind of late. And his career only lasted 10 years. But what's especially distinctive and noteworthy about Van Gogh's career is that when he began at the age of 27, he couldn't draw. When you see some of his early drawings, they're amateurish to the point where if he had submitted them to like a drawing academy, chances are these days he'd be rejected. He'd be told, you are wasting your time. If Van Gogh is able to overcome those early limitations in what seemed to be his ability and rise to the highest level in the history of art, then anything is possible for anybody you do not know in advance. You can't see into your nature, your essence. It reveals itself over time. You might be bad at something and bad at something until one day, suddenly, you're good. And that is true for anything in any direction. And as long as, and the major advice is, you don't give up. Once you give up, the process stops. But even that's not absolute. You can give up for some period of time, have other experiences, and then return sometime later to what you were pursuing and find that the time away and the experiences away were decisive to the achievement. The point I'm stressing is the uniqueness of every set of circumstances and experiences, and at any point that new set of circumstances could be the ones that open the doors to what you're trying to achieve.
Mr. Friedman, a lot of young people, I think, will see this podcast. So, what will be your message for the young people? What would you like to send to them?
First of all, the significance of their uniqueness, that no one in the history of the world has experienced what they have experienced. No one in the history of the world is experiencing what they are experiencing right now, in wherever they are, in whatever direction. I want people to understand that they are not off in some insignificant corner of the universe, on some minor planet, going around some average star, in one of billions of galaxies, that every human being, in fact, every existent thing, is at the still center of existence because of, among other things, the nature of existence, the nature of what it means to be in the world and not be able to remove yourself from the world and see from the outside that you're off in some corner. It's only from the outside of existence that you could make that kind of claim. From within the world, you are at rest, you are at the center, and you are in a position of dignity that cannot be challenged unless you allow it to be challenged. The circumstances don't permit it. And so it's important to recognize that, again, wherever anybody else has failed, wherever anybody else has experienced frustrations or disappointments, your experiences being different might be decisively different to allow for the success. So I want people, there's a famous comment that the 20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher, made after World War II. During World War II, France was occupied, part of it was conquered, other occupied by Germany, by Nazi Germany. Sartre made the comment after the war, we were most free during the occupation. We were free of the past. One of the essential goals is to recognize the importance of freeing yourself from any limitations that you imagine the past to be imposing. You can use the past. I mean, it's been said, those who don't know the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, there's value in that, but there's also value in recognizing that the past cannot guarantee the future. And so whatever limitations the past has demonstrated or revealed can at any point cease to apply. So where others have failed, you can succeed. You can, and the future decides the past. You can make the future your own through whatever choices you feel inclined to make, and those choices are as reasonable as the choices that any other human being can make. So you have to embrace the essential dignity of your circumstance.
Thank you so much, Mr. Friedman, for being our guest today. It was an honor.
It's a pleasure, and I really wish you luck with these podcasts moving forward. And again, it's been a privilege for me to be here.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.